Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Today's guest is Dr. Scott Smith. He's an apologist, philosopher, and professor at the Tablet School of Theology. On today's episode, you can expect to learn why you probably think like a naturalist and why that's dangerous, how to demonstrate the existence of a world that is beyond the physical, the way in which philosophy is fundamentally essential to science, some of Dr. Smith's favorite book recommendations, and much more. I was so excited to have someone with Dr. Smith's experience and knowledge on the show. He's wicked smart. So without further ado, please welcome to the show, Dr. Scott Smith. Dr. Scott Smith, thanks for taking time to come on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you talk to me a little bit about what naturalism is and like how that school of thinking operates?
Well, there's some different aspects, of course, to naturalism and how it gets worked out in, maybe different fields or disciplines. But at least ontologically, naturalism is roughly, the view that there's only the natural, that exists. There is no supernatural. Usually that can be taken to mean that there's only the physical. It's the only stuff that's real. There would be no God, no angels, no souls, no mental states, that are irreducible to just, mental or to minds, like thoughts, beliefs, desires, those sort of things. But there could be another variation of that, and that could be one where basically the physical is what's really doing all the work. The brain, or the nervous system is what's, doing the work, and you could have from different brain states or configurations of neurons, you could have emerged from there, some people hold, things like, irreducible mental states, thoughts, beliefs, etc. But, pardon me, those things are causally impotent. They are free riders, on the physical. So basically, it's the physical's doing all the work. So just as a general sense, again, the naturalism is this, at least in terms of what is real ontologically, it's the view that there's only the natural, which is usually understood to be the physical, with that caveat I mentioned.
Yeah. And so I've heard this argument before. I can't remember who from, but that it's kind of an argument for materialism and for like an atheist perspective of the world that would say material things require, or observably material things have only had material causes. And so we have to deduce causally that the world has only ever been material and never spiritual because we've never seen a material effect from a non-material cause. Does that about kind of summarize that way of thinking?
Well, and I think something that's influenced our thinking that way has been what came through the scientific revolution. It was a revival of the old Greek atomism, thinking that what is ultimately real are just atoms in motion, and that what exists in creation, quote unquote, because there's still largely a Christian worldview and in play in Europe at the time, they're all mechanisms. So the universe is a mechanism. We are mechanisms made, basically just of atoms. And what is ultimately real are, primary qualities, not secondary qualities. Primary ones, are these ones that fit with that kind of definition of what's real, that can be measured, materially. And it also had the view of nominalism. Things are what they are in name only. They're only concrete, particular things, that exist. Once you have that, there's no room for essences, which was Aristotle's idea of a formal cause. And there's no teleological end, toward which all things, are directed or proceed to reach their maturity. There's no final goal, a final cause. So Bacon dropped both those sort of things and just embraced, like a material cause, for one, um, and that fits with this view again of what is real. Um, so yeah, when you accept that kind of view of what's real or views about what's real, you are bracketing out any sort of other kinds of causes from a mind or an immaterial agent, like God, and things like that. You and you wouldn't expect to see that kind of thing if you think what's real is all empirically observable, at least in principle. Um, you might try to infer from that, but if you hold that that's what's really real, then, well, as we've seen it play out, more and more, God and other such things like agents, will eventually get marginalized, and out of the picture.
I feel like nowadays people, learn in public school the scientific method and, kind of like observe and deduce. Um, do you think that that has caused the majority of people, I guess at least in like the Western Hemisphere, to have a very naturalist bent to their thinking?
Yeah. What you just described plays into something I like to write and talk about a lot is the fact value split. Um, the idea there that science is the set of disciplines that uniquely gives us knowledge, where of what is true in reality. But on the other hand, things that don't follow the scientific method, which has been especially ethics, religion, and largely the rest of the humanities, those things end up being relegated to just areas of opinion and preference or our own, our constructs. And I think this kind of mindset, because of what's, driven, it's been driven by a lot of this, the prestige given to science and even a scientism, whether in a weak or strong form. We cannot help but be affected by that, in the West, or wherever the reach of these views have gone, because it is just part of the air we breathe, so to speak. And to that, because of that, I think Christians cannot help but be affected by it. We have to very self-consciously, think through that and resist that, to have our minds conform to the image of Christ and His truth. But yeah, I think that kind of the scientific method with those other assumptions behind a scientism very, very much, very deeply shapes Western people into a naturalistic kind of mindset.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. How, given that for most people, like myself included, that's going to be um, a fundamental way that we're taught to think at a young age, how can we start to kind of break free from that way of thinking, or to make it like, more of a tool and less something that we're kind of subject to all the time?
Well, that's a great question.
Thank you.
I'm trying to think of well, obviously, as far as we're talking as a couple academics, here, that there's been a lot of great stuff written, especially like by J.P. Moreland, and he has I forget if I get the order of these words right, but Science and Secularism, I think is the title, or else it's the other way around, Secularism and Science. Pretty recent
Mm-hmm.
book. He's done a lot, to try to help break down, these kinds of things. Uh, I think that this was something. Here's a little more practical orientation to it, though. Um, because I knew about this kind of mindset, and I'd already gone, through all my grad school before I became a dad. Um,
Mm,
I was aware of, that this kind of thinking is something that my own daughter would just absorb, from culture. And
mm,
so I made it my point, you besides trying to be, a loving and enjoyable and, dad, playing with her and whatnot, but I would look for opportunities to sow seeds, to get her to think and to realize that there's more to what's real than literally meets the eye.
mm.
Uh, so, reality of souls, reality of God, things like that. Now, uh, something I did, just a quick story, about this. I remember
Yeah.
when she was in preschool, and uh, you know, you would have these kind of days where a parent would come in and tell about what they did, for work. And so they had a bunch of cool parents coming in, and here was a firefighter and um, some other city engineer or whatever. Well, I come in and I'm a philosopher. So it's like, oh, I already got a couple strikes against me.
Hmm.
How do I, how do I talk to them about what I do? So what I decided to do was I put together a little picture book, and I showed pictures of I forget if I picked on myself or if I did it on probably myself, and I just showed pictures of me uh, at different stages of my life. One when I was even in a crib, I found one of those, and several other pictures, even on to the present day. And I asked them, how is it that it's all me? How is it that it's me through all these? Look, I'm so different, and I've changed, all these ways. Well, because I had already, told this, or helped explain this to my daughter, she blurted out, like, it's your soul, Daddy. Well, and then the preschool teacher kind of picked up on that and helped give some more reasons, for the rest of the kids to go, oh, we
Mm,
really do have souls. And so I was just picking on an example of something I think that is common sense if we just pay attention to those things, that there's got to be more to what's real than meets the eye
hmm.
or our five senses. So
Hmm.
that's just an anecdote, to say about how to help illustrate that. And if we really start paying close attention to what can be for our minds and conscious awareness, I think we really can become aware of things like essential natures, even of myself as distinct, from my own body and things like
Hmm.
this, or God's presence, too,
Yes.
other
Yeah,
things.
absolutely.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's not a direct answer to your question, but kind of a couple anecdotes, maybe to, kind of get at it a little bit.
No, that helps because it kind of shows that um, the only ways to like dialogue about that aren't incredibly complex. There's some fairly intuitive ways to talk about a transcending reality beyond what's literally just materially there. So that is helpful.
I think so.
What is the role of philosophy in the world of science? And I'll kind of expand on what I mean. I have a friend who's studying psychology in college, and he's not a Christian, but we'll have, we'll dialogue sometimes about human nature or like the way that people act. And what's interesting is that there's a sense in which I think that he thinks, and I think he would agree with me on this, that as someone who does a lot of philosophy but has no expertise in psychology or neurology, everything I can contribute to the conversation is theoretical and less, and therefore less substantive than what a scientist could contribute. And I see, in a very simple sense, what he's saying. So, do you think he's right? Does philosophy have something to contribute where there are like experts in science? Does that make sense?
Well, I just finished reading a little book. It's pretty accessible. Um, it would make for some interesting conversations, perhaps with this very fellow or
Hmm.
with others. But it's simply called Have We Lost Our Minds? And it's by Stan Wallace. He's president of Global Scholars. Um, he went through the MA philosophy program with me, then went on. So I think he was ABD, as far as, with his philosophy background, and then got a D Min from Talbot, in that. Anyway, he's well qualified to write on this. But what he's doing is he's writing about um, how this kind of naturalistic, physicalist, kind of view about what kind of thing human beings are, and how this is being embraced by some Christians in what they're called, or what's being called neurotheology. And they're arguing, they're they're trying. At least one of them, Wilder and Thompson, are the last names of the two people. Um, they are arguing that if you properly understand Dallas Willard's views, I think they're very mistaken on this, but they say that if you properly understand that, really what spiritual formation all comes down to is formation of the brain or neuronal, formation. So spiritual formation, I guess, maybe overstating it a bit, or maybe oversimplifying rather, is brain formation. Uh, so it's reducible to just that. Well, Willard, is trying to bring in, in his own writings, a lot of philosophical insight, as well as spiritual. And I think they're very wrong, because he's very clearly advocates, for the existence of the soul and philosophical exposition of it and whatnot. But they see no place for that. It's all about science, and how do we grow spiritually? Well, it's physically, it's in terms of the formation. So what's this philosophy have to say to this? Not much, if anything, maybe just clarify some concepts, perhaps. Well, what Stan, is doing in this book is taking them to task, and showing that their own views presuppose all sorts of different philosophical positions, and they cannot possibly deliver, on their claims based upon what they think is real. And I would add, to it too, that based upon what they think is real, it's not even possible to have interpersonal relationships, which are vital, in spiritual formation, including with the Lord. So I don't think we could even have a personal relationship with the Lord, much less be conformed to the image of Christ. We would have interpersonal relationships with one another in the body of Christ, which is crucial for us as far as being becoming, like Christ, loving one another and all these things. So philosophy has a whole lot to contribute on this stuff, to say, here's the kind of thing or being I am. I'm an embodied soul. I'm a deep unity, as Stan calls it, a holistic kind of dualism of body and soul. And such that they deeply interact together. How do we explain that? Based upon, he says it's based upon like an Aristotelian Thomistic kind of dualism. So he's able to give all sorts of cogent explanations for all these sorts of things. And it's based upon the philosophical assumptions of what's real. Whereas when you apply the views of what's real from these neurotheologians, it falls flat, and will undermine, I think, the very things that they're claiming, that we should do to grow spiritually. So this is an application in one particular area, like spiritual formation, but he's touched on things there that have far-reaching implications. And he also highlights how this can affect our spiritual formation in terms of like 8 different kinds of disciplines or aspects of life. Even business, I think, is one. But it's really good. So
And what's the name of the book again?
Have we lost our minds?
Have we lost our minds? Okay.
It's quite new. It just came out with Stock. I've
Okay.
really enjoyed
Thank
it.
you.
It's quite good.
Yeah. So kind of the to synthesize a little bit, kind of the fundamental understanding there, if I'm understanding you correctly, is that science frequently operates on philosophical presuppositions,
Yes.
and a scientist that's unaware of those presuppositions can kind of make blunders in his work because he doesn't really know where he's coming from.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah. And it can lead you to being, well, easily embrace the idea of scientism. Again, that science, uniquely strong scientism, science has the corner of the market, I like to say, on giving us knowledge, or a weaker one, it, it is vastly superior kind of knowledge, we get from science than from other sources. But if you don't really realize how philosophy provides justification for trusting our senses, for example, or different, it provides principles of logic, that can be used, or even, things about how we know things, or the nature of what's real, or even then ethics, because sometimes people say, well, here's to oversimplify, but I heard this somewhere. Maybe I'll remember this very in the application. I just heard this, but again, the old saying, "We can do this, therefore we ought to do this. We can do
Hmm.
this scientifically, so therefore we ought to." Well, really, what are the ethical implications? Maybe of this. We just stepped out of the realm of science, and now we're
Hmm.
drawing upon philosophy. And ethical theories are not going to be justified um, solely based upon empirical observations.
Right.
um, so yeah, there's all sorts of complex ways, and a great little book I still like to go back to is J.P. Moreland's Christianity and the Nature of Science. He
Hmm.
has a great couple chapters about the nature of the interaction and dependency relationship of science on philosophy
Hmm.
and theology. I think
Hmm.
that's really helpful stuff, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. That is very helpful. Yeah. So, Sir Francis Bacon in the New Organon talks about the separation of kind of the philosophic method and the scientific method. I'm now using my terms, but because I'm not as smart as Sir Francis Bacon, so I can't say it as eloquently as him. But he would say like, oh, philosophy has value, but its value is distinct and limited because it is all like a priori thinking. It's all theoretical, and so he in the work kind of pushes the idea like take that and use it for the things that it's for. But on the other hand, let's have a different school of thinking that's all based on things we can observe, kind of what we've been talking about this whole time. But it seems like, given what we just talked about, that you might tend to disagree with Sir Francis Bacon, that there's a very important and serious integration between those two schools of thought. Am I understanding that right?
Yes, and I think if we bifurcate those things like he did, well, I think it leads to some potentially some real serious errors. Again,
Hmm.
like I mentioned, I think he was very influenced by the overall mindsets of the time, in the scientific revolution. Again, the mechanical atomism and the nominalism. So you think that these things are what's real. Um, so that's why I think he, or a big reason why he got rid of any need for Aristotle's appeal to final or formal, causes.
Hmm.
Um, but something that I think, though, and this is, I'm stepping away from Bacon a little bit here, just making a more
Yeah, go
general
for it.
comment. But I think that something good, by focusing attention in science upon what is observable is that one thing that's happening, I forget exactly what period off the top of my head, but in the Middle Ages, um, people were starting to make new discoveries beyond, what Aristotle knew was real,
Mm,
biologically. And uh, all of a sudden, it's like, okay, now what do we do with this? You know, how do we deduce things using, from it's this kind of essence or something, and what, how do we deduce from that, into, use Aristotle's method here, and so I think they started, becoming aware of, more things in existence and other things in existence that Aristotle did, and there was a good focus on let's go out and actually observe things rather than simply try to deduce things,
mm.
uh, from what we know. So I think that's a good that in itself is not a bad thing.
Right.
It's a
Yeah.
very useful, good thing. Uh, I think like with COVID-19, we had to do all sorts of different studies and observations and tests to try to say, well, what is this thing? How does it behave? What's it respond to? Therefore, how to best, try to treat or prevent or, whatever. Um, so that has a good place. To simply try to work from a framework where everything's laid out, from these are all the essences, and therefore we deduce from those things, can lead to mistakes that don't
Mm,
actually match up with the real world.
mm,
So I think in that sense, the emphasis on using good empirical observation to investigate in the natural world is a good thing. But on
mm,
the other hand, you need to bring that together with the helpful, good insights from philosophy, that justify, those scientific presuppositions,
mm,
that, inform us about the nature of what is real. Okay, well, let's do our observations. Now let's think about them in light of what's the best explanation for what this kind of thing is? And I think, that's where Aristotle's really onto something. Things
mm,
have a teleological nature. They
mm.
have an essence. They change in law-like ways and these sort of things.
Right.
Uh, we may come across some observations, though, that kind of make us go, maybe we kind of misunderstood how to classify this
Mm,
particular organism or something. Hmm.
mm,
Or I'm just, that's probably a simple, observation. So, yeah, I think that these things should not be kept separate. I think they can mutually inform each other. Um, and especially, I think um, again, I think it's important to realize that a lot of these shifts back from the scientific revolution were driven by philosophical assumptions. And
mm,
are those themselves justified? Well, that's going to require philosophy, to look at,
mm.
and theology,
Yeah.
too.
Yeah. No, that's super helpful. It almost seems like this isn't really what this is for, but it almost seems like this kind of Aristotelian mean of pursuing truth, where you have like on one side an excess of only the empirical experiential knowledge of the world, and that can lead to a distinct set of mistakes, and then on the other side you have all theoretical thinking, and that can lead to a certain set of mistakes, and then in the middle you have the two of them, and they balance each other out and complement each other very nicely.
Yeah, different parts of God's creation we know in different sorts of ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to know a soul is real just by going out and trying to, touch it, you know,
Right. Right. Yeah.
or taste it or something like that. But yeah,
Hmm.
these there's a saying. I'm not sure if I picked this up from Willard or JP, but I like to say, um, how we know something depends upon the kind of thing it is,
Hmm.
and so there are ways of coming. Well, Edmund Husserl would probably say something like this, where there are there are ways of coming closer epistemically, that is, to know something, but it depends upon the kind of thing it is. Uh, you know,
Sorry, epistemically?
epistemically, in terms of how
What?
we know something.
Sorry, what does that word mean? I have
Oh,
no clue.
epistemically, you just
Yeah.
it's just how how we can come, to know something.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. No, wow. Thank you. That's very helpful. Well, we're about out of time. But before we wrap up, um, where can people go to find books or articles that you have written? Because I know you've done quite a bit of work.
Um, well, probably one place to go would be Biola's faculty pages for in under Talbot.
Mm,
I think my CV there is updated, so if you
mm,
download it, take a look at it. I've got a few books listed there,
mm-hmm.
not all of them, and certainly not chapters or all the articles and whatnot. But
Right.
yeah, they're in the CV there. I also have a website, rscottsmithphd.com. Now I'm not using that as far as blogging all the time, but I do post some blogs occasionally, and I
Mm,
do use it as a reference kind of place and post some videos. But my CV and maybe some blogs or whatnot about some different books and whatnot, that have come out, I'll have there, as well. And my most recent book was with Lexington. It is Exposing the Roots of Constructivism,
mm,
Nominalism and the Ontology of Knowledge. Uh,
mm.
so that's the most recent philosophical book, that I've done.
Yes. Wow. Well, very cool. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Well, thanks for having me. Good to be with you.